The Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure will come to order. Pursuant to Committee Rule 5F, House Rule 11-2H4, the Chair may postpone further proceedings today on any question approving a measure or matter and drop amendment on which a recorded vote or the ayes and nays are ordered. And without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare recess at any time. Hearing none. Today, the committee will consider H.R. 1497, the Water Quality Protection and Job Creation Act of 2019, H.R. 4719, the Fish Safe Act, and H. Conres 37, expressing support for designation of October 28th as honoring the nation's First Responders Day. Before we start with that, I just want to address something that caused a little consternation last week. I was referring to the Surface Transportation Bill and work that we've begun on that. And there are certainly areas on the Surface Transportation Bill where the committee will be working together. But I know that there is somewhat of a difference between my side of the aisle and the other side of the aisle on the issues of climate change, climate crisis, defossilization in terms of surface transportation. And I don't expect there will be much interest in that title, but it is going to be a very prominent and strong title in the bill, building on what was adopted in a bipartisan way in the Senate. So if there is interest in working on those provisions, great. If not, we intend to have them in the bill one way or another. So I just want to make that clear. But otherwise, we're sticking with the tradition of the committee in that we try and do things in a bipartisan nature. I want to thank the members of the committee for their support on harbor maintenance. I started on that 23 years ago with Bud Schuster, not Bill Schuster, Bud Schuster. Is Bud's portrait, there's Bud over there, and there's Bill over there. So thank you, Bud. It only took us 23 years to get that done. So let's move on. H.R. 1497, Water Quality Protection Job Creation Act. It's the first item up for consideration. I now call up H.R. 1497, ask unanimous consent to discharge Subcommittee on Water Resources and Environment from further consideration of H.R. 1497. That be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. Without objection, so ordered. I have an amendment in the nature of substitute. Clerk shall report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of substitute to H.R. 1497, offered by Mr. DeFazio.
Without objection, the amendment in the nature of substitute should be considered as read. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of substitute should be considered as base text for purposes of amendment. I would now recognize myself in support of the bill. I strongly support the amendment in the nature of substitute, which authorizes $16.68 billion in infrastructure over the next 5 years to address America's crumbling wastewater infrastructure and water quality challenges. It's my understanding that this will be the first reauthorization since 1987. Been a few years. We've all seen firsthand that our infrastructure is outdated. I was a county commissioner back in the days when the federal government was a significant partner to jurisdictions that were under state and or federal mandates to clean up their systems. We got an 80% federal match to build a system and since then the community has more than doubled in size, and that system is still more than adequate to meet our needs. We wouldn't have had that without help from the federal government. And around the nation, there are many communities that are under state or federal mandates to either rebuild, expand, or build new wastewater systems. And we have not been a good partner in this effort. And I think should this bill be successful today, we will be renewing federal help to communities across America. Our wastewater treatment systems are given a grade of D+ by the American Society of Civil Engineers. The EPA and states say that communities need close to $300 billion in investment over the next 30 years, about $10 billion a year, to bring the current systems into a state of good repair. However, it doesn't account for all the challenges facing our communities because many of our communities, particularly in coastal areas or in floodplain, floodway areas, need to make their systems resilient to climate change. We've seen a number of incidents, Texas and elsewhere, where these systems have gone underwater during extreme weather events, and we have to anticipate that and prevent that in the future. It also has to be assistance that goes to communities of all sizes, particularly rural and small communities that might otherwise not be able to affordably address their local water quality challenges. You can't take a small rural city with not particularly high incomes and tell people their sewer bill is going to be $200 a month. They need a little help getting this done. They need help from their state, and they need help from the feds. We have never, as I said earlier, reauthorized this program since 1987. H.R. 1497, as amended, represents a renewal of the federal commitment to invest in our wastewater infrastructure, address local water quality challenges. This amendment authorizes the biggest investment in wastewater infrastructure since the 1980s. $14 billion for the Clean Water State Revolving Fund over 5 years. Although we need to invest more to get our systems in state of good repair, I would like to have this number higher. 14 billion over 5 years is a start, and I appreciate the ranking member and working with me on this. I've been discussing this for a number of months. It also increases the portion of clean water SRF funding that can come in the form of grants or other loan subsidies, reauthorizes several important Clean Water Act grant programs such as Sewer Overflow, Stormwater Grant Authority, Alternative Water Source Grant Authority. And these changes are intended to make clean water systems more affordable to communities and ratepayers, in addition to addressing local water quality challenges. These are critical dollars, and there's much more in my statement, but I'm at that point, I think I've said enough, and I'll put the rest of it in the record. So with that, I'd recognize the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm proud to support the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1497, which represents a bipartisan agreement to address the nation's wastewater infrastructure needs. States and communities across the country, they face some tight budgets and some difficult choices when it comes to balancing their needs with available resources, especially our rural and smaller communities. This amendment addresses the substantial and growing wastewater infrastructure needs throughout our communities by reauthorizing those critical programs under the Clean Water Act. In particular, this measure ensures that small and rural communities are going to be better addressed through some set-asides in programs for sewer overflow and stormwater management projects, for watershed and resiliency projects, and for alternative water source projects. In addition, by providing for extended permit terms, added up to another 5 years, the amendment's going to reduce the administrative burdens and bureaucracy, and it's going to give those communities much more flexibility to take on complex wastewater infrastructure projects. This measure also provides for more EPA technical and planning assistance to rural and small communities working to comply with the federal requirements. And finally, this bill is simply good government. It reauthorizes programs which have not been reauthorized in decades. While they continue to receive regular appropriations, passing this legislation would allow us, as the authorizing committee, to weigh in on these issues. Now, I urge my colleagues to support the amendment in the nature of a substitute and yield back the balance.
I thank the gentleman, and I did, at the end of my statement, neglect to thank Chairwoman Napolitano, who's original co-sponsor, Don Young, former chairman of the committee, original co-sponsor, gentleman from New York, Mr. Katko, and these members, along with 50 other of our colleagues, are sponsors of this legislation. With that, I would recognize the chair of the subcommittee, Ms. Napolitano.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thoroughly support H.R. 1497, the bill that authorizes the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, the primary funding mechanism for states to upgrade, maintain, and build wastewater treatment works. Thank you, Mr. DeFazio, for your leadership, and Mr. Young, Mr. Katko, for working together with us in a bipartisan manner. It is great to see this. As we have discussed in the committee room many times, the community needs almost $300 billion of investment over the next 20 years just to bring the systems in the state of good repair. That number does not even include what is needed in the future. In my home state of California, there is needed more than $26 billion to address wastewater treatment needs, pipe repairs, recycling water distribution, sewer overflows, and storm management. 1497 will get us the path to addressing the need, starting anyway, and I am particularly pleased that it includes $2.5 billion in grants that provide for innovative water projects that help all aspects of water recycling to capture from capture to treatment to supply. In my district and across the country, the challenges of drought, floods, contamination require us to create multi-benefit projects such as water recycling, stormwater management, and groundwater replenishment. The grant program will authorize this bill, and this bill will save taxpayers money excuse me, by having water agencies work together to solve multiple water problems in singular projects. I also want to commend the great work for the subcommittee vice chair and other members that improved the bill. At the request of Congresswoman Markup Powell, the amendment codifies the Clean Water State Revolving Fund Green Reserve at 15% set aside for green infrastructure projects that provide energy or water efficiency improvements or other environmentally innovative activities. This has been a successful program in the past and will ensure states keep working on innovative and efficient projects. The amendment also incorporates provisions from Congressman Stanton that authorize states to use a portion of the Clean Water SRF funds to promote workforce development and utility worker training, plus education programs. This is vitally important so that we have people prepared to be the next generation of workers in the field. And I'd like to thank Congressman Carvajal for working with us to include a provision that provides $110 million over 5 years in grants for innovative ways to address wet water discharges and to increase resiliency of utilities to natural or man-made disasters, ensuring that our infrastructure is resilient as we face challenges from stronger storms, flooding, climate change has got to be a priority. The amendment includes a provision of Congresswoman Trahan that requires states to set aside a minimum of 10% of annual clean SRF funds to provide grants to communities with affordability issues, to provide communities with higher federal match for those projects. I know many of our districts have similar concerns, so this will have those communities in constituency. I ask my colleagues to join us in supporting this vital legislation, and I certainly want to thank our staffs from both sides for putting together the bill. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yield back.
Thank you, gentlelady. Mr. Westerman. Oh, no, thank Mr. Katko. Mr. Katko.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to support H.R. 1497 and the Water Quality Protection and Job Creation Act. I was proud to join the chairman, Subcommittee Chair Napolitano, Representative Young in introducing this legislation earlier this year. I want to especially thank my dear friend, Chairman Napolitano, for working with me on these issues. We work together a lot on many other issues, including mental health and suicide prevention, and it's good that we can work on other issues as well together, so thank you. By reauthorizing funds provided through the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, H.R. 1947 will help communities across the country in addressing growing water demands for essential water infrastructure improvements. Critically, the legislation would make common sense improvements to the permitting process for wastewater treatment projects, providing necessary flexibility for municipalities to invest in these projects over time. Additionally, H.R. 1497 makes critical investments in improving the resiliency of public wastewater utilities, assuring the availability of clean water in disaster-impacted areas. Like so many communities nationwide, water quality issues are critical to my district in central New York, and we have a lot of pipes in our district that are over 100 years old, and we have a wastewater system that is hemorrhaging water from the pipes that ends up overwhelming the wastewater system, and we're in the process of trying to fix that as well, and this bill is going to help that. So I applaud the committee for taking up this legislation to improve federal support for essential water infrastructure development. I look forward to working with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to continue addressing this pressing issue. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I apologize. I got up to be at NPR at 6 o'clock this morning, and the coffee isn't strong enough, and Mr. Westerman had a statement, and he is the ranking, so I'm going to go out of order here. I shouldn't have recognized you yet, John. Anyway, Mr. Westerman.
Thank you, Chairman DeFazio, and thank you, Chairwoman Napolitano, for working in a bipartisan manner to bring this bill as presented in the nature, as an amendment in the nature of a substitute to the markup today. I believe that with this bipartisan amendment, we're in a much better position than where we originally started on this bill. And as Chairman DeFazio mentioned, the American Society of Civil Engineers has given our water infrastructure a grade of D+, and we can do much better than that in America. Communities across the nation are struggling to comply with the requirements of the Clean Water Act while investing in aging wastewater infrastructure. This bill is a major step in the right direction towards helping communities address these challenges. Many of the Clean Water Act programs in this bill haven't been reauthorized in years. The Clean Water State Revolving Loan Fund hasn't been reauthorized in nearly 30 years, yet it remains the best tool in the toolbox for states to address their critical water structure needs. H.R. 1497 will also reduce administrative burdens and provide states and municipalities with greater permitting flexibility to take on these complex projects by providing them with the opportunity to extend MPDS permit terms from 5 years up to 10 years. Communities have struggled to address their infrastructure needs due to shrinking municipal budgets, insufficient independent financing capabilities, and increasingly burdensome regulations. This bill will greatly help communities, including small and rural communities, to address these needs. Additionally, I've always encouraged our state and our communities to look at innovative ways to protect our critical water resources, such as using natural design ideas like green infrastructure, and I'm glad this bill further supports these efforts. For these reasons and others, I urge my colleagues to support the amendment in nature of a substitute to H.R. 1497, and I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman, and again, I apologize for not recognizing him in order. Other statements on my side of the aisle? Anyone have an opening statement? Yes?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Madam Chair Grace Napolitano, for allowing me to speak on such an important piece of legislation. I want to add my support today for the Water Quality Protection and Jobs Act. I always say water is life, but actually clean water is life. This bill is crucial for investing in and upgrading our wastewater systems. All over Florida, we have a great need to transition from septic to sewer systems, and our wastewater systems are old and they're failing. Sewage is leaking into our oceans, causing beach closures, posing a risk to our health and our environment, and it's threatening our economy. We need to do better. But that doesn't mean just repairing old pipes. It also means being innovative and creative in how we address these issues. It means finding solutions that consider climate change and more intense rainfall. Earlier this year, I introduced the Water Infrastructure Sustainability and Efficiency Act, the WISE Act. This bill will require a 20% set aside for the Green Project Reserve, which means that where possible, states must use the portion of their Clean Water State Revolving Fund dollars on energy-efficient projects or green infrastructure, like porous pavement, rainwater harvesting, and my favorite, green roofs. Creative solutions like these will help reduce flooding, protect water quality, and enhances energy efficiency. I am pleased that the committee adopted this initiative and included a 15% set aside for the Green Project Reserve in today's bill. We have to work to consider all options to renew our water infrastructure and protect our health and our environment. I am pleased to support this legislation. I yield back.
Other comments on the Republican side? Yes, Mr. Graves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, first, I want to thank you for your earlier statements about the surface bill. I think this committee has a long history of transcending some of the partisan fighting, and I'm hopeful that we can maintain that. So I do want to thank you very much for your comments, and this bill is an example of that, where you do have bipartisan support. Mr. Chairman, as we move forward on this, though, I do want to make note that there are a few things that we do need to be thoughtful of as we do move forward. Number one is ensuring that we also look at compliance, cost compliance regulations to ensure that our regulations are most efficiently achieving the objectives we all share in regard to clean water. Number two, we all recognize that we could spend hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars on water infrastructure. Yet when you look at local government officials, oftentimes you see folks out there whenever you're cutting ribbons on highways and roadways and things like that to In my life, anyway, I've never seen anyone go out there and cut the ribbon on a wastewater treatment plant. It's not a sexy investment. And what ends up happening, which brings me to my next point, is that I think that folks become increasingly dependent upon federal dollars and ensuring that as we move forward, there is a maintenance of effort, that our state and local partners continue to make appropriate investments and don't become increasingly dependent just on federal funds. And lastly, Mr. Chairman, I think that this committee, we have jurisdiction over infrastructure, and we could easily spend trillions of dollars across this country on aviation, surface, water, pipeline, and other infrastructure investments across the United States. Rather than continuing to have programs that throw insufficient dollars at every single area of infrastructure, I do hope that as we move forward with different infrastructure bills, we can be very deliberate about what the federal role in infrastructure is and be a reliable federal partner that provides ample funds on an annual basis. Instead of having all these different programs, some well-funded, some not, it creates a lot of uncertainty for state and local government funding and ultimately undermines the objectives of these infrastructure programs. I support this legislation. I appreciate the bipartisan way this was put together and look forward to this moving through the floor. Urge adoption. Yield back.
Thank the gentleman for his remarks. Mr. Garamendi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and congratulations to you and to Mr. Graves for putting this together, Mr. Napolitano and Mr. Westerman. All very, very good, but like everything that's good, there may be something that we may want to deal with. I do want to thank you for including in the bill most of my legislation, H.R. 1764, which provides for a 10-year rather than a 5-year permit for wastewater treatment systems for municipalities. When we introduced it last March, people said there was not a problem. Well, in fact, there was, now that we recognize it, and it is in the bill. The permit terms should reflect the complexity of modern wastewater treatment and recycling projects. The 1972 things were fairly simple. They're not now, so the 10-year permit is appropriate. However, there is a potential problem in the bill going forward, and that is that all of these permits may wind up with the EPA rather than at the state level. We need to have some clarity on that going forward. I look forward to working with you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Westerman, Mr. Graves, as this thing moves forward. So with that in mind, I congratulate you and look forward to continuing to work on the legislation so that we can make sure that these wastewater treatment facilities are actually built and under a 10-year permit. I yield back and look forward to perfecting the bill in the months ahead.
I thank the gentleman. Others on this side? Seeing none, then, Mr. Carball.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to Chairwoman Napolitano as well for the hard work that went into coming to this bipartisan agreement to reauthorize the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. I served in local government before I came to Congress and continue to interface with many of our local government agencies, and I can tell you this is an extremely important reauthorization. This is a good agreement to help increase our investments in our nation's water infrastructure. It goes a long way in helping bring our water infrastructure to a state of good repair, supporting good-paying jobs and increasing resiliency. I am proud to have worked with Chairman Napolitano and Chairman DeFazio to ensure resiliency is a part of this legislation to fund our nation's infrastructure. And I'm extremely gratified to see that my legislation was also included in this proposal. As we continue to see the prevalence of extreme weather events become more common, this is a step in the right direction. It would ensure we are supporting smart investments to build or rebuild threatened water infrastructure, increase efficiency in the use of water, or implement advanced treatment technologies such as water reuse and recycling, which is transpiring to a great extent in my district. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. Seeing no one on that side, I think we have one more speaker, Mr. Stanton.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the committee's work over these past several months on this critical legislation. to reauthorize the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. In my state of Arizona, we have $6.7 billion in wastewater infrastructure needs over the next 20 years. The bill before us today makes significant federal investments so that we begin to tackle needs both in my state and across our country. However, it is not enough to provide the federal investment for those infrastructure needs. We must also make sure we have the trained workforce necessary to operate these facilities today and well into the future. The municipal drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater management sector is facing massive workforce replacement needs. Approximately 1/3 of drinking water and wastewater operators in the U.S. will be eligible to retire in the next 10 years, taking with them considerable professional knowledge and experience. The ability of our communities to protect public health and the environment relies on maintaining and building a dynamic workforce. Yet all too often I hear from my communities in my state about the challenges in finding people to operate these critical facilities. I appreciate the committee focusing on this issue and including in this substitute amendment my bill, the Wastewater Infrastructure Workforce Investment Act. This bill will allow states to reserve up to 1% of the funds they are allocated each fiscal year under the Clean Water State Revolving Fund for workforce development, training, and retraining activities. This important provision will provide another avenue to assist our communities in addressing these critical workforce development needs. And I want to thank Chair DeFazio and Chair Napolitano and the committee staff for working with me on this important issue. I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. Any other members? Hearing and seeing none, we will proceed. Are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute?
There are.
Gentleman has an amendment. Then the gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have 3 amendments at the desk, co-sponsored by Mr. Lamaffa, and I request unanimous consent that they be called up en bloc.
Without objection, the clerk will designate the amendments en bloc.
En bloc amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1497, offered by Mr. Garamendi, consisting of the following: Garamendi 083, Garamendi 084, and Garamendi 085.
Without objection, so ordered. I recognize Mr. Garamendi to speak on behalf of his amendment.
Okay, I ask unanimous consent that the amendments be considered as read. Okay, then.
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, my 3 amendments to H.R. 1497 would remove arbitrary restrictions in the current law so that projects in western states that receive funding from the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation may also participate fully in the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's Alternative Water Source Projects pilot program. My amendment's co-sponsored by Mr. Lamaffa, and this amendment would benefit 17 reclamation states in the West, including California, Hawaii, Virgin Islands, and Oregon. Western states like California California needs approximately $51 billion for water infrastructure over the next 20 years. I appreciate that in your amendment, in the nature of a substitute, you do lift some of the arbitrary restrictions on reclamation-funded projects participating in the Alternative Water Source Projects pilot program. However, some restrictions remain, and I don't understand why we would want to restrict the western states. Furthermore, I don't understand why federal financing, the RIFIA and WIFIA programs, which must be repaid by local project sponsors, cannot be used to satisfy the matching requirements in the current law or under the bill as proposed. It seems to me that those restrictions should also be removed. The Western Recycling Water Coalition, Reuse Association, and the Sanitation Districts of Los Angeles County brought the amendments, brought these issues with 1497 as introduced to the committee's attention back in May. It's my understanding, however, there has not yet been consensus among the Big Four, and therefore my amendments seem to be objected to. I'll ask if maybe Mr. Lamaffa has some comments. If he does, following his comments, I intend to withdraw my amendments.
Mr. Mr. Lamalfa is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate working with my colleague, Mr. Garamendi, on these amendments and many other issues that we work together on. I think, again, with our Western water system, we're always dealing with drought, dealing with stretching our water system as far as we can to meet needs. And indeed, the charge of the Bureau is to reclaim water, reuse water, and treat wastewater, all good, laudable things that we talk about a lot around here and back at home in California. California is 1/8 of the population of this country. And so for it and the other Western states to not have a full place at the table is a little disappointing. But again, progress is being made in the bigger bill, and I appreciate that some of those pieces that Mr. Garamendi is working on as well are incorporated. But when we're looking at a situation as he emphasized that RIFIA should be able to be included in this as a federal cost share, because this is not free money. This is money that is to be paid back. It just allows those municipalities and others to have a better interest rate. No real hurt or cost to the federal government. So we'll continue to work on this. I appreciate the attention to it in this committee, and again, being able to help Mr. Garamendi with this bipartisan effort. So I yield back. Thank you.
Thanks, gentlemen. I believe Mr. Garamendi has already asked unanimous consent. Is there any objection to unanimous consent request to withdraw the amendment in nature of en bloc? Okay, without objection, so ordered. And the amendment's withdrawn. Are there any other amendments to the bill? Hearing, seeing none, then we will proceed. If not, the question is on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The amendment in nature of substitute is agreed to. The question is now on adoption favorable reporting of H.R. 1497 as amended to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Those opposed by saying nay. The ayes have it. The bill is approved and ordered and reported favorably to the House. Next item for consideration is H.R. 4719, the Funding Instruction for Safety, Health, and Security Avoids Fishing Emergencies Act. Wow. Okay. I now call off H.R. 4719, asking unanimous consent to discharge the Subcommittee on Coast Guard Maritime Transportation for further consideration of H.R. 4719, and that it be considered as read and open to amendment at any point without objection. So ordered. I have an amendment in the nature of substitute. Clerk shall report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of substitute to H.R. 4719, offered by Mr. DeFazio.
Without objection, the amendment in the nature of substitute shall be considered as read. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of substitute shall be considered as base text for purposes of the amendment. I'll recognize myself to speak in favor. I support H.R. 4719, the Bipartisan Fish Safe Act, introduced in the House of Representatives by Jared Golden of Maine and Don Young of Alaska. The bill restores the federal share of fishing vessel training and research grants back to 75%, fixing a decrease to 50% created last Congress by the Coast Guard Authorization Act. Additionally, the bill would extend the authorization for each grant program an additional 2 years to 2021. Senators Ed Markey and Dan Sullivan have introduced very similar legislation, which has been included in the Senate Coast Guard Authorization Act 2019. I'm happy to note the robust bipartisan and bicameral support for this non-controversial bill, which advances the health, safety, and economic security of commercial fishermen and women and their families. The amendment, in the nature of a substitute, does two things. First, it provides for a retroactive effective date in order to ensure grant recipients under the previous cost share regime can take full advantage of the program. Second, it makes several non-controversial changes to various authorities related to the former U.S. Lighthouse Service, a predecessor agency to the contemporary Coast Guard. Lighthouse Service became part of the Coast Guard in 1939. Subsequent to that change, most statutes dealing with aids to navigation, including lighthouses, were codified within the Coast Guard's permanent authorities found in Title 14 U.S.C. However, some provisions dealing with Lighthouse Service remained in Title 33 of the U.S. Code's navigation. This amendment enacts a recommendation of the Office of Law Revision Council to repeal those few Lighthouse Service authorities Coast Guard has found no longer necessary and transfer the remaining provisions to Title 14. I appreciate Ranking Member Gibbs and the minority for working together with us on this amendment. I support H.R. 4719 as amended. Encourage my colleagues to do the same. I now recognize Ranking Member Graves for a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In 2010, Congress imposed safety requirements on the commercial fishing industry, or at least commercial fishing vessels, and established the Fishing Safety Training Grant Program and the Fishing Safety Research Grant Program. In 2018, Congress transferred responsibility for the grant programs to the Department of Health and Human Services. The amendment in the nature of a substitute sets the federal share for the grants at 75% and extends the authorization for the grants through fiscal year 2021. The amendment also includes provisions updating laws dealing with the former Lighthouse Service, which became part of the United States Coast Guard in 1939. I commend Congressman Golden and the Dean of the House, Congressman Don Young, for introducing this bipartisan measure. And with that, I thank Chairman DeFazio and Subcommittee Chairman Maloney for working with us on the amendment in the nature of a substitute, and I'd urge my colleagues to support the bill, and with that, yield back.
Do other members wish to be recognized? Seeing none on my side, Mr. Graves.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I just want to very quickly say that in the Natural Resources Committee, which, as you know, has jurisdiction over the actual fisheries, through some of our hearings, we found where we have some certain commercial fishers that are out there making seven figures every year without ever putting a line in the water, simply being given these catch shares from the federal government, have turned around and leased those or rented them out on a yearly basis and are sitting back not fishing, in some cases in other countries making up to seven figures. I understand this is fishing safety, and certainly Louisiana being one of the largest commercial fishing states in the nation, I am supportive of the grant and the program, but as we move forward, I do think we should look at some of these commercial fishers that are receiving all sorts of funds from the federal government without an appropriate due to the taxpayers of the public of this public resource. I again say that I do support this legislation, being one of the top commercial fishing states in the United States, but would love to work with you all as we move forward to ensure that we're being fair to taxpayers. Yield back and urge adoption.
I appreciate the gentleman's concerns and be happy to take a look at that. We certainly don't want someone who isn't fishing and is living off a leased permit to be getting these sorts of grants, and want to be certain that this won't be happening under this legislation. Other members wish to be recognized? Seeing none, are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute for H.R. 4719? Seeing none. If not, the question is on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. Amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. Question is now on adoption favorably reporting H.R. 4719 as amended to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed by saying nay. The ayes have it. The bill as amended is approved and reported favorably to the House. Last item for consideration is H. Conres 37, expressing support for designation of October 28th as honoring the nation's First Responders Day. I now call up H. Conres 37, ask unanimous consent to discharge the Subcommittee on Economic Development, Public Buildings, Emergency Management from further consideration of H. Conres 37, and that it be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. Without objection, so ordered. I now recognize myself to speak in favor. I want to thank the gentleman from North Carolina and our late colleague and friend, Elijah Cummings, for introducing this legislation earlier this year. Very simply, this bill would establish October 28th as a day to honor our nation's first responders and recognize their commitment to keeping our communities safe. We all represent dedicated first responders who every day prioritize the well-being of our communities above all else. On blue sky days, we take for granted their daily efforts and constant training, but these professionals in fire, rescue, emergency medical services, law enforcement, emergency management ensure that our communities are ready for darker days, whether natural or man-made. We are witnessing some of their bravery right now in California as wildfires rage. Thanks to hot and dry weather, stronger than normal Santa Ana winds. Thousands of firefighters are working around the clock to contain these fires, protect lives and property. First responders make up a relatively small portion of our nation's population. Only 4.6 million career and volunteer professionals nationwide out of a population of 330 million, but their impact is immense. They certainly deserve a National Day of Recognition. I support this resolution strongly, and I urge my colleagues to do the same. I now recognize Ranking Member Graves for a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank Subcommittee Ranking Member Meadows. I do appreciate his leadership on this resolution. And I also want to join you in thanking our colleague, friend, former member of this committee and chairman of the Oversight Committee, the late Elijah Cummings. This resolution shows our bipartisan support in honoring our first responders, these men and women. They head into harm's way on a regular basis to save lives. When disaster strikes, it's our nation's first responders that leave their families and their loved ones, and they put their own lives at risk to ensure the rest of us are safe. More than honoring our first responders, this resolution honors our former colleague, Mr. Cummings. His work in a bipartisan manner on this resolution for an honorable cause is a microcosm of his career here in Congress, working with any and all, no matter their political views, to do what he believed was right. He was a treasured member of this committee and will be greatly missed, and I support favorably reporting continuing resolution 37 and yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman. Other members wish to be recognized? Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm looking forward to supporting this resolution, and I thank those of you who are legislated it. I spent 23 years as a first responder in the city of Duluth, Minnesota, and I can tell you that, Mr. Chair, your comments resonate so much with me about the men and women that leave their families, head into harm's way at all hours of the days and night. They leave Christmas dinner, Thanksgiving to help people in need, and I couldn't be more proud to vote yes on this, and I thank you for your leadership, Mr. Chair and Ranking Member Graves.
I thank the gentleman. Ms. Norton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I think it's fitting that we close this markup with this resolution. Although the entire markup has been bipartisan, this is a particularly worthy resolution. You will note that Mr. Meadows and Mr. Cummings, a Republican and Democrat, who work closely together, have introduced this resolution. I want to also say that our first responders, particularly as we look at the wildfires in California, which are devastatingly, make our hearts go out to all of our colleagues, should remind us that we take our first responders for granted. My great-grandfather was a fireman, so I particularly revere them, but I revere them much more today when climate change and other disasters have made their work so much harder, and I think this resolution is very worthy to close this markup. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
I thank gentlelady. Others, seeing none there, Ms. Finkenauer.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you to my colleague, Congressman Meadows, with Congressman DeLauro and the late Congressman Cummings, moving this resolution forward. Congress and this committee feels emptier without Congressman Cummings, and I am glad to see his work to recognize our first responders continue here today. Thank you for the opportunity to speak on this resolution and for the opportunity to share why this is so important to me. You see, my late grandfather was a firefighter, and he's the guy that taught me what public service was all about. I remember growing up, I didn't know anybody else in public service. He was the only one I knew, and lucky for me that our firefighters are some of the best examples of what public service is all about. You see, when he would get a phone call to run into a burning building, he didn't call back and ask, "What color's your skin? How much money do you make? Who do you love? Where are you from?" He just showed up, and he helped people, and he did his job. And that, to me, again, is what public service is all about. That's what we should have here in this body and across our country. And today, it is an honor to get to pass this resolution honoring our first responders who show up every day, who stand up for our communities. And I am proud that October 28th will be the day of honoring the nation's first responders. And with that, Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady for the eloquent statement. Other members which should be recognized? Seeing none. Are there any amendments to H-Con Res 37? Hearing and seeing none. The question is now on the adoption favorable reporting of H-Con Res 37 in the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed by saying nay. The ayes have it. Bill is approved and reported favorably to the House. I ask unanimous consent that each bill ordered and reported today will be reported as a single amendment, nature of substitute incorporating amendments adopted without objection. So ordered. I ask unanimous consent that the staff be authorized to make all necessary technical, clarifying, conforming changes to each of the bills ordered reported today to reflect the actions of the committee without objection. So ordered. Pursuant to House Rule 22, Clause 1, I ask unanimous consent that the chair as designee be authorized to offer such motions as may be necessary in the House to go to conference with the Senate on legislation adopted today or a similar measure. Without objection, so ordered. I ask unanimous consent that pursuant to Rule 11, Clause 2L, members have at least 2 calendar days in which to file any supplemental, minority, additional, and dissenting views on the legislation adopted today. Without objection, so ordered. I ask unanimous consent that the chairman, after consultation with the ranking member, has authority to strike or revise any provision of the bills ordered reported today that would cause a sequential referral to another committee or that cause the bills are on concurrent resolutions to be subject to a Budget Act or stupid Rule 21 PAGO, point of order. Without objection, so ordered. Pursuant to Rule 5 of the Rules Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure, the chair notes presence of quorum for actions taken on all committee business today. With that, the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure has completed its business today, and the committee is adjourned.